Tonight, we stand before the realm of destruction, not the mindless chaos of collapse, not the random violence of ruin, but destruction with purpose, change through obliteration, revolution written in fire and blood. This is the sphere of Mehrunes Dagon, Daedric Prince of Destruction, and this is his complete story. Before we settle in, I've noticed that many who listen here aren't subscribed, and that's perfectly all right. But if these quiet journeys through Skyrim help you unwind at the end of the day, subscribing is a simple way to support the time and care that goes into them, and it makes it easier to return whenever you like. Now, let the world grow softer. To understand Dagon, we must first understand what destruction truly means. Most mortals see it as ending, as loss, as tragedy to be prevented. They build their cities and their empires and their lives around preservation, around maintaining what is, around resisting change. Mehrunes Dagon sees differently. To him, destruction is not ending, but transformation. The forest that burns becomes fertile ground for new growth. The empire that falls creates space for different civilization. The order that shatters allows freedom previously impossible. Destruction is necessary, inevitable, and in its own way, creative. This philosophy has driven his actions across millennia, from ancient conflicts between Daedric princes to his dealings with mortal cultists, from the creation of artifacts that embody his power to the greatest invasion Tamriel has ever witnessed. Every act of destruction served purpose. Every fire burned to clear ground for something new. The mortals who serve him understand this, though they express it differently. Some seek revolution against unjust systems. Others pursue personal transformation through destroying their old selves. A few simply embrace chaos as release from constraints of ordered society. All are drawn to Dagon's promise that through destruction comes change, and through change comes possibility. But Dagon's nature is more complex than his followers realize. He is Daedric Prince, which means he operates according to logic that mortal minds struggle to comprehend. His sphere encompasses not just destruction, but also ambition. Not just revolution, but also hope for what might replace what was destroyed. He is patron of those who would tear down the old to build the new, even when the new is no better than what preceded it. His realm of oblivion reflects this duality. The Deadlands are landscape of fire and molten stone. Ruined structures dot the horizon, remains of whatever existed before the current destruction, or perhaps what will exist after the current destruction ends. The sky burns perpetually. Rivers of lava flow where water would run in Mundus, and yet there is order to the chaos. The Deadlands are organized, structured, following rules as rigid as any mortal empire, just rules written in different language. The Dremora who serve him embody this contradiction. They are destroyers, yes, warriors who excel at killing and conquest, but they are also highly organized, following strict hierarchies and codes of conduct. They serve Dagon with discipline that would shame many mortal armies. Destruction does not mean disorder in the Deadlands. It means destruction applied with purpose and precision. Among the artifacts associated with Mehrunes Dagon, one stands above the others in significance and power. Mehrunes' Razor, a blade that can kill anything with single strike, that can pierce any armor, shatter any ward, end any life, regardless of how protected or powerful. The razor is destruction concentrated into physical form. It is death made tangible, and its history is stained with blood across centuries. The razor's origin is debated by scholars. Some claim Dagon forged it himself from his own essence. Others believe it was created by mortal smith who made terrible bargain. A few suggest it existed before Dagon, and he merely claimed it. The truth is lost to time or deliberately obscured. What matters is what the blade does and what possessing it costs those who wield it. The blade itself is deceptively simple in appearance, curved like crescent moon, dark metal that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, handle wrapped in material that might be leather or might be something else. no jewels or elaborate decoration, just form following function. And that function is killing with absolute efficiency. But the Razor is more than weapon. It is also conduit to Dagon's realm. Those who possess it find themselves drawn to destruction. Their thoughts turn toward revolution, toward tearing down what exists. Dreams are filled with fire and ruins. The blade whispers in ways that have nothing to do with sound, suggesting possibilities that require first destroying obstacles in the way. Some wielders resist this influence. They use the Razor as tool while maintaining their own moral compass. They kill only when necessary, only targets who deserve death, only in service of causes they believe just. These wielders find the Razor serves them well, though they often notice the blade seems almost disappointed when sheathed without blood. Others embrace what the blade offers. They become avatars of destruction in their own right. They kill not from necessity, but from desire to see their enemies unmade. They pursue revolution, not for better world, but for satisfaction of watching old world burn. These wielders accomplish terrible things before the blade inevitably destroys them too, because Mehrunes' Razor respects no loyalty. It serves Dagon first, wielder second, and only until wielder becomes obstacle to greater destruction. The cults that worship Mehrunes Dagon follow similar patterns. Some see themselves as righteous revolutionaries. They identify genuine injustice in existing order and seek to destroy it, believing that what replaces it must be better simply because what exists is so terrible. These cultists can sometimes accomplish positive change, though the methods they use, assassination, sabotage, inciting violence, make them criminals regardless of motivation. Other cults are nihilistic destroyers. They worship Dagon not for what destruction might create, but for destruction itself. They burn buildings not because those buildings represent injustice, but because watching things burn satisfies something in them. They kill not to remove obstacles, but because death is ultimate form of change. These cults are typically short-lived, destroyed by authorities before accomplishing much beyond localized terror. The most dangerous cults are those that combine both impulses. They genuinely believe in revolution, in destroying unjust order, in creating space for something better. But they also embrace destruction as good in itself. They convince themselves that any act of violence serves greater cause, that all existing structures are obstacles, that anyone who opposes them deserves death because opposition proves corruption. These cults can persist for generations, always finding new enemies to destroy, new revolutions to pursue, new fires to light. Throughout the Second and Third eras, worship of Mehrunes Dagon was relatively contained. His cults operated in shadows, occasionally surfacing to commit violence before being suppressed. His influence was real, but limited. Mortals feared him, yes, but fear kept appropriate distance. The barrier between Oblivion and Mundus held strong, maintained by ancient conventions and by Akatosh's covenant that prevented Daedric princes from direct invasion. This balance persisted for millennia. Dagon influenced events through his cults and artifacts. He granted power to those who served him. He whispered promises of revolution to those dissatisfied with existing order. But he remained in his realm, watching Mundus through eyes of his followers, unable to walk directly upon the mortal plane, until Mankar Camoran found the way. But that story comes later. For now, understand this: Mehrunes Dagon is not random chaos. He is not mindless destroyer. He is force of nature given consciousness and will. He is change incarnate. He is revolution as divine principle. And while mortals might debate whether destruction serves good or evil, to Dagon the question is irrelevant. Destruction simply is, as necessary as birth, as inevitable as death, as eternal as the void from which all things emerge and to which all things return. The Prince of Destruction watches still, from the Deadlands, through his razor, via his faithful, waiting for next opportunity to bring change through fire, to transform world through force, to prove again that nothing built by mortals can withstand forever what Dagon represents. that all order eventually faces destruction, that all empires eventually fall, that all resistance eventually breaks against the tide of necessary change. Tonight, we tell his story, from nature and sphere to artifact and cultists, from ancient dealings to modern crisis, from philosophy to practice, from whispers in darkness to invasion that nearly ended world. The complete history of destruction as power, as principle, as destiny. The flames are waiting. The story begins. Chapter 1. The Nature of Destruction. To understand Mehrunes Dagon, we must first understand what destruction means in the context of Daedric Princes. These beings are not gods in the sense mortals usually understand the term. They did not create Mundus. They do not govern its laws. They exist parallel to mortal reality, occupying their own realms of oblivion, following their own natures with consistency that mortals interpret as divine will, but which might be more accurately understood as metaphysical law. Each Daedric Prince embodies a concept or set of concepts. Azura is transition and twilight. Meridia is light and life energy. Molagbal is domination and enslavement. These are not choices the princes made, but fundamental aspects of their existence. They cannot act against their nature any more than fire can choose to stop burning, or water can decide to flow upward. Their nature defines their actions, which in turn reinforce their nature, creating eternal cycle. Mehrunes Dagon's nature is destruction, but is specifically destruction as transformation. The subtle distinction matters enormously. He is not interested in mere obliteration for its own sake. Random violence does not serve him. Mindless chaos does not attract his favor. What draws his attention is destruction that creates space for something new, change forced through demolition of what existed before. Consider a building standing for centuries. To most, it is simply structure serving its purpose. To those who preserve tradition, it represents history worth maintaining. To Mehrunes Dagon, it is obstacle. Not because the building itself offends him, but because its existence prevents different building from occupying that space. Destroying it creates possibility. What replaces it might be better or worse than what stood before, but the act of replacement itself serves Dagon's sphere. This extends to social structures, political systems, religious institutions. An empire ruled by dynasty for generations appears stable, perhaps even beneficial to its citizens. But stability means stagnation in Dagon's view. The dynasty prevents other forms of government from emerging. The laws and customs that developed under dynasty constrain what people might become under different system. Revolution that topples the dynasty, even violent revolution, creates space for transformation. And transformation serves destruction's purpose. The philosophical question this raises has troubled scholars for ages. Is destruction ever justified if what replaces destroyed thing is no better? Mehrunes Dagon's sphere suggests the answer is yes. Destruction creates possibility. Whether that possibility is realized in positive or negative way is separate question. The act of creation through destruction is valuable independent of outcome. Stagnation is the true enemy. Maintenance of existing order is resistance to natural cycle of change. Mortals struggle with this philosophy because they experience destruction personally. When revolution comes, real people die. When empire falls, real families lose their security. When old order is swept away, real communities face uncertainty about what replaces it. The abstract principle of creative destruction offers little comfort to those whose lives are destroyed in the process. This tension between philosophical justification and practical suffering defines much of Dagon's interaction with mortal realm. His Dremora servants understand this better than mortals do, though from different perspective. They serve Dagon not out of philosophical agreement, but because service is their nature. A Dremora warrior exists to fight, to conquer, to destroy obstacles to their lord's will. They are not troubled by moral questions about whether destruction serves greater good. They simply are what they are, following their nature as inevitably as Dagon follows his. The organization of Dremora. Society reveals interesting aspect of Dagon's nature. Despite being Prince of Destruction, the forces he commands are highly ordered. Strict hierarchies govern Dremora interactions. Ranks from lowly churl to mighty Valkanas are rigidly defined. Protocols for addressing superiors are elaborate. Rituals surrounding preparation for battle are formalized. The Deadlands operate with military precision. This seems contradictory until you recognize that Dagon's sphere is not chaos, but destructive change. Order can serve destruction just as effectively as disorder. Well-organized army destroys more effectively than random mob. Disciplined soldiers following strategic plan accomplish more demolition than individuals acting on violent impulse. The order serves the destruction, which serves the transformation, which serves the principle. The physical nature of the Deadlands reinforces this understanding. The realm is a landscape of perpetual destruction, yes, but destruction following patterns. Lava flows in rivers that, while deadly, are navigable by those who understand them. The ruins that dot the landscape, while broken, follow architectural logic. The sky burns, but the light it provides is consistent enough to plan by. Chaos exists within framework of order, suggesting that destruction itself requires structure to maximize effectiveness. Mortals who have survived visits to the Deadlands report similar observations. The realm is hostile, certainly. Everything there seems designed to kill visitors or at minimum make their presence uncomfortable. But it is not random. Those who study the patterns can move through the Deadlands with reasonable safety. Those who understand the hierarchy can sometimes negotiate with Dremora rather than immediately fighting them. The realm follows rules, just not rules that prioritize mortal comfort or survival. Mehrunes Dagon himself rarely manifests directly even within his own realm. Those who claim to have encountered him describe massive figure composed of burning elements. 4 arms, 2 legs, powerful build, suggesting strength beyond mortal comprehension. Face that combines features from multiple species, as if Dagon's form reflects all races he might destroy. Voice that speaks with authority of absolute conviction, believing fully in necessity and righteousness of destruction he brings. But these descriptions are filtered through mortal perception, attempting to comprehend being that exists on different level of reality. What Dagon truly is, separate from how mortals perceive him, remains unknowable. He is Daedric Prince, which means his essence is tied to his sphere in ways that transcend physical form. Describing his appearance is like describing what fire looks like. You can note flames and heat and light, but you miss the fundamental nature of combustion itself. His power is similarly difficult to quantify. Daedric princes operating within their own realms are essentially omnipotent. Within the Deadlands, Dagon can reshape reality according to will. He can create or destroy with thought. He can alter physical laws to suit purpose. Mortals who challenge him in his realm face not just powerful opponent, but opponent who defines rules of engagement, who cannot truly be harmed because realm itself sustains him, who can end confrontation by simply willing intruder to cease existing. Outside his realm, Dagon's power is constrained but still formidable. He can influence events through agents. He can empower followers with fragment of his essence. He can create artifacts that carry his will across realms. He can whisper in minds of those open to his message. These are not small abilities. Many conquerors and revolutionaries across history accomplished terrible things while claiming to serve Mehrunes Dagon, and whether they truly channeled his power or simply invoked his name while following their own ambitions, the results were equally destructive. The question of whether Mehrunes Dagon is evil troubled philosophers and theologians throughout the eras. The argument against his evil is that destruction is a natural process. All things eventually end. All structures eventually fail. All order eventually yields to entropy. Dagon simply accelerates and directs processes that would occur anyway. He is force of nature given consciousness, no more evil than earthquake or fire. The argument for his evil is that conscious choice to cause suffering, even in service of philosophical principle, constitutes moral failing. That Dagon could choose not to destroy, could choose to let change happen gradually rather than violently, but actively pursues destruction even when alternatives exist. That his followers commit atrocities in his name with his blessing. That he has invaded mortal realm, killing thousands because he desired to and could, rather than because any necessity required it. Perhaps the truth is that applying mortal concepts of good and evil to Daedric princes is category error. They are not moral agents, in sense humans understand morality. They are fundamental forces, given consciousness. Asking whether destruction is evil is like asking whether gravity is evil. It simply is. It operates according to its nature. It affects mortals who exist within its influence. Whether those effects are beneficial or harmful depends on circumstances and perspective, not on any intent toward good or evil. But mortals must navigate world in which Mehrunes Dagon exists and acts. And from mortal perspective, his actions often appear straightforwardly evil. The cities he burns contain families. The empires he topples provided order and security. The revolutions he inspires lead to violence and suffering. The abstractions of creative destruction offer no comfort to those destroyed in the process. This brings us to the Razor, the artifact that embodies Dagon's power in most direct and deadly form. Chapter 2. Mehrunes Razor, the blade that ends everything. Among all artifacts associated with Daedric princes, Mehrunes Razor holds unique place. Not because it is most powerful. Arguments could be made for several others holding that distinction. Not because it is most coveted. Princes like Azura or Meridia offer artifacts with more universal appeal. The Razor is significant because it distills Dagon's sphere to its purest essence. Ending. The blade kills anything with single strike when its power fully activates. Not merely injures, not simply wounds gravely. It ends existence of whatever it touches. The greatest warrior in the heaviest armor falls as easily as unarmored peasant. The most powerful mage with strongest wards dies as quickly as person with no magical defense. The blade does not care about protection or power or destiny. It cares only about ending what exists, so something else might take that space. The mechanics of this power have been studied by those brave, or foolish enough to research such things. The Razor does not simply cut exceptionally sharp edge through flesh and bone. It severs connection between body and whatever force animates it. Soul, life force, divine spark, whatever you name the essence that makes living thing alive rather than dead, the Razor cuts that connection. Death is instantaneous because the thing that sustained life simply stops functioning. This works even on beings that should be effectively immortal. Vampires can be killed with normal weapons, yes, but they are notoriously difficult to keep dead. The Razor ends them permanently. Liches who have bound their souls to phylacteries elsewhere can be destroyed by the blade, when other means would simply force them to respawn. Even Daedra, who typically reform in Oblivion when killed in Mundus, find that death by Mehrunes Razor is more permanent than deaths by other means. The blade does not activate this power with every strike. If it did, it would be most feared weapon in existence, and wars would be fought solely to possess it. Instead, the instant death effect triggers seemingly at random. Most strikes from the Razor function as ordinary blade strikes, deadly enough from skilled wielder, but survivable with proper armor or healing. But occasionally, perhaps one strike in 10 or 1 in 20, the blade's true power manifests and the victim dies regardless of circumstances. This randomness serves Dagon's nature perfectly. You cannot rely on the Razor to kill any specific target at any specific moment. You cannot plan assassination around certainty that blade will activate. All you can do is strike repeatedly, trusting that eventually probability favors death. This uncertainty mirrors destruction itself. You can create conditions that make collapse likely, but you cannot control exact moment when structure fails. The psychological effect on both wielder and opponent is profound. Facing someone who carries Mehrunes' Razor creates fear that goes beyond normal combat danger. Every blocked strike, every parried blow, every dodged slash is moment when death might have occurred but didn't. The knowledge that any hit might be instantly fatal makes prolonged fight psychologically exhausting even before physical fatigue sets in. For the wielder, the blade creates dangerous mindset. The possibility of instant victory with any strike encourages aggression. Why bother with careful technique when wild swinging might land lucky hit that ends fight immediately? Why use strategy when pure chance might deliver success? This has led many Razor wielders to develop reckless fighting styles that eventually got them killed by opponents who fought more carefully. The curse commonly associated with the Razor is extension of this effect. Those who possess the blade find themselves drawn toward violence as solution to problems. Negotiations become frustrating when you know single strike could resolve dispute permanently. Peaceful resolutions seem unnecessarily complicated when death is so readily available. The blade does not force wielder to kill, but it makes killing appear so easy, so tempting, so efficient that resisting temptation requires conscious effort. Long-term possession of Mehrunes' Razor typically ends poorly. Either the wielder dies in combat, having developed over-reliance on blade's chance of instant death while neglecting actual fighting skill, or they are assassinated by others who fear the Razor's power and strike before it can be used against them. Or they are claimed by cult of Mehrunes Dagon, who view the blade as holy relic belonging to their prince rather than tool for individual use. Or they simply go mad from constant whisper of destruction in their thoughts, eventually using blade on themselves or forcing others to put them down. The few who successfully wield Mehrunes' Razor over extended periods share certain characteristics. They treat the blade as a dangerous tool requiring respect rather than guaranteed victory. They maintain skill with ordinary weapons, viewing Razor as backup rather than primary armament. They resist impulse toward violence when peaceful solutions exist. They understand that possessing artifact of Daedric Prince comes with costs that might eventually exceed benefits. And they accept that one day, inevitably, the blade will find new owner because that is its nature. To cycle through wielders, each one eventually destroyed so next can take their place. The Razor's physical properties beyond its death-dealing power are notable. The blade never dulls. It requires no maintenance or care. It cannot be broken by ordinary means. It remains sharp and functional regardless of how it is stored or what it cuts through. This durability suggests the blade is not merely metal shaped to a particular form, but is instead physical, manifestation of concept. Destruction as principle given tangible existence. The blade endures because destruction endures. It remains sharp because ending is always available. It cannot be broken because you cannot break the concept it represents. Scholars have attempted to determine the Razor's origin through various means. Historical research identifies mentions of the blade across multiple eras in multiple provinces. Archaeological evidence suggests similar blades existed in civilizations predating modern historical records. Magical analysis reveals the artifact resonates with energy signature matching Mehrunes Dagon's sphere. But definitive answer regarding when and how the Razor came into being remains elusive. The most commonly accepted theory is that Dagon forged the blade personally from his own essence, that he took piece of his fundamental nature, the ending aspect of destruction, and gave it physical form that could operate in mortal realm. If true, this suggests the Razor is not merely powerful artifact, but is fragment of Daedric Prince himself. Possessing it means carrying piece of Mehrunes Dagon wherever you go. Using it means wielding Dagon's power directly, rather than through intermediary blessing or ritual. Alternative theories exist. Some claim the Razor was created by Master Smith, who made bargain with Dagon. trading their skill and soul for knowledge needed to forge blade of ultimate sharpness. Others suggest it existed before Dagon claimed it, perhaps forged during Mythic era, when rules governing reality were more flexible. A few propose that multiple razors exist simultaneously, each one genuine article from perspective of whoever possesses it, because artifact associated for new life by removing old life. Every for new life by removing old life. Every death by the blade serves Mehrunes Dagon's sphere, whether wielder intends to serve him or not. Every strike that lands, whether it instantly kills or merely wounds, is offering to Prince of Destruction. And every possessor of the Razor becomes, willingly or otherwise, agent of destructive change simply by carrying the blade. In Skyrim, during the Fourth Era, the Razor resurfaced in particularly dramatic fashion. A cult calling themselves Mythic Dawn, remnants of larger organization we will discuss later, had hidden pieces of the blade in Mehrunes' shrine. They believed that reconstructing the Razor would allow Dagon to manifest more fully in Mundus. Whether this belief was accurate or simply cultist fantasy remains unclear. What is certain is that those who reunited the blades, pieces found themselves holding weapon of terrible power that came with familiar curse. The questline surrounding the Razor's recovery illustrated patterns that repeat throughout its history. Initial discovery by those seeking power. Realization that power comes with costs. Temptation to use the blade despite costs. Eventual recognition that ownership of Mehrunes' Razor is temporary condition that usually ends in death. Some Dragonborn who completed this quest chose to destroy the blade or seal it away. Others kept it, believing they could resist its influence. History suggests the latter group is usually wrong, though perhaps being Dragonborn provides advantages that ordinary mortals lack. But the Razor, significant though it is, represents only one aspect of Mehrunes Dagon's influence on mortal realm. To understand the full scope of his impact, we must examine those who worship him. The cults that burn in his name, the revolutionaries who invoke his blessing, the destroyers who believe themselves instruments of necessary change. Chapter 3. The Cults of Destruction. Throughout history, certain individuals and groups have worshipped Mehrunes Dagon with devotion that transcends normal religious practice. These cults do not simply pray to distant deity or perform rituals asking for favor. They actively work to manifest Dagon's sphere in the mortal world. They pursue destruction as holy calling. They view themselves as agents of necessary change, burning away corrupt old order to make space for something better. The psychology of those drawn to Dagon worship is complex. Some are genuinely motivated by revolutionary ideals. They identify real injustices in existing systems, oppression, inequality, corruption, and conclude that reform is impossible, that the systems are too entrenched, too defended, too invested in their own continuation to ever change peacefully. Destruction becomes not just means to end, but necessary first step toward any improvement. These ideological cultists can be surprisingly sympathetic when you examine their motivations. A peasant living under brutal lord who taxes them into starvation while living in luxury. A member of marginalized group denied basic rights by dominant culture. A scholar who sees fundamental flaws in civilization's structure and believes only starting over can address them. Their turn toward Dagon worship is not madness, but desperation born from genuine grievance. The danger is that destruction rarely creates what destroyers intend. Revolution that topples unjust lord often leads to chaos, where warlords compete and common people suffer worse than before. Burning corrupt system creates vacuum that next corrupt system fills. Even when revolution succeeds in installing better system, the path from old to new is paved with bodies. The ideological cultist believes these costs are acceptable, that end justifies means. History suggests they are usually wrong. Other Dagon cultists are motivated by personal rather than political grievances. They have been wronged by specific individuals or institutions and desire revenge. A man whose family was killed by bandits who bribe guards to avoid justice. A woman whose property was stolen through legal but unjust means. A child who suffered abuse from authority figures who will never face consequences. Their turn to Dagon is not about changing world, but about destroying those who harmed them. These personal cultists are often more dangerous than ideological ones because their goals are specific and achievable. They don't need to overthrow empire. They need to kill 3 men or burn 1 building. Mehrunes Dagon is happy to grant power for such tasks if approached correctly. The petitioner who performs right rituals, makes right offerings, opens their mind in right way, can receive blessing that makes revenge possible. And once revenge is achieved, they often become willing tools for further destruction because they have already crossed lines that previously constrained them. A third category consists of nihilists who worship destruction as good in itself. They are not trying to create a better world or achieve personal revenge. They simply enjoy watching things burn. They find beauty in collapse. They are drawn to end of things the way others are drawn to beginning. These cultists are rarest, but most disturbing because their motivations are entirely divorced from justification that makes sense to normal moral reasoning. The nihilistic Dagon cultist is often a person who has experienced loss so profound that meaning itself has broken for them. Someone who watched their entire village burn in war they didn't understand, fought over causes they didn't care about, killing everyone they loved for reasons that seemed arbitrary. The absurdity of existence became impossible to ignore. If meaning is illusion, if value is arbitrary, if everything eventually ends anyway, why not embrace ending? Why not find purpose in purposelessness of destruction itself? These 3 types, ideological revolutionary, vengeful personal victim, philosophical nihilist, represent majority of Mehrunes Dagon's mortal worshippers. But variations exist. The academic who studies destruction as art form, documenting different ways civilizations collapse. The artist who creates through destroying existing works, believing that breakdown of old art creates space for new art. The mystic who seeks transformation through destroying their ego, using Dagon's sphere as spiritual practice. Not all cultists are violent criminals, though violence follows them more often than not. The rituals associated with Dagon worship vary wildly based on which cult practices them and what they hope to accomplish. Some rituals are simple blood sacrifices, killing animal or person in Dagon's name, typically by burning. Other rituals involve destroying objects of value, breaking art, burning books, demolishing buildings, as offering. A few require self-mutilation, removing piece of one's body permanently as demonstration of willingness to embrace destructive change. More elaborate rituals attempt to create conditions for Dagon to manifest. These typically involve multiple participants, extensive preparation, rare components, and precise timing. A circle of blood around fire, incantations in languages that predate modern speech, offerings that required months of collecting. The ritual performed during celestial alignment or on date, significant to Dagon's history. If executed correctly, these rituals can open doorway to Deadlands briefly, or call forth Dremora to bargain with, or even, in rarest cases, allow Dagon's consciousness to touch mortal world directly. The outcomes of successful complex rituals range from beneficial to catastrophic, depending on perspective. A cultist who successfully contacts Dagon might receive power beyond mortal normal capacity, strength to challenge enemies, magic to burn obstacles, weapons that never miss their marks. Or they might be consumed by energies they summoned, their bodies breaking as vessels for force too great to contain. Or they might bind themselves to Dagon's service so completely that their will becomes extension of his, losing autonomy in exchange for power. For the cult as whole, successful major ritual usually precedes period of intense activity. Emboldened by proven connection to their prince, they pursue destruction with renewed vigor. They recruit new members by demonstrating power. They plan more ambitious attacks. They believe they are on verge of achieving their goals, whether those goals are revolution or revenge or simply more destruction. This period typically ends when authorities finally respond to a threat that has become too obvious to ignore, crushing cult before it accomplishes anything lasting. The relationship between different Dagon cults is interesting. They rarely cooperate. Each cult tends to view their own interpretation of Dagon's will as correct, and others as misguided at best, heretical at worst. The ideological revolutionary despises the nihilistic destroyer for wasting Dagon's power on meaningless violence rather than purposeful change. The personal victim dismisses the revolutionary's grand theories as excuse for cowardice in pursuing their own specific grievances. The nihilist scorns both for pretending destruction serves higher purpose when real beauty is in purposelessness. Mehrunes Dagon appears to encourage this division. A unified cult working towards a single goal might accomplish more, but unity also creates structure. Structure is order. Order is opposite of destructive change. By keeping his followers divided and competing, Dagon ensures they embody his sphere more fully. They destroy each other as readily as they destroy his enemies. This chaos serves destruction better than coordination ever could. The historical record contains numerous examples of Dagon cults appearing, causing destruction, and being eliminated. In every era, in every province, groups form claiming to serve the Prince of Destruction. Most last only years or months before being destroyed by authorities or rivals, or their own internal violence. A few persist for generations by operating carefully, recruiting selectively, and avoiding actions that would provoke overwhelming response. None have successfully transformed society in ways they intended, though many have destabilized regions and ended lives. Until the Mythic Dawn, the cult that succeeded where all others failed, the followers who found way to bring their prince physically into mortal realm, the believers whose actions started most catastrophic war Tamriel had witnessed in thousands of years. Their story is not merely cult history, but pivotal moment when destruction almost won. When Mehrunes Dagon's sphere nearly consumed all of Mundus. When mortals faced possibility that their world might end not through natural disaster or gradual decline, but through calculated invasion by force that embodied ending itself. But before we can understand the Mythic Dawn and what they accomplished, we must understand the man who led them. The prophet who believed he had found path where all others saw only barrier. The scholar who decoded texts everyone else thought meaningless. The madman or genius, possibly both, who gave Mehrunes Dagon key to invading Mundus, Mankar Camoran, and his impossible message. Chapter 4. Mankar Camoran, the Prophet of Destruction. To understand how Mehrunes Dagon nearly succeeded in consuming all of Mundus, we must understand the man who made it possible. Mankar Camoran was not typical cultist driven by simple motivations. He was scholar, mystic, visionary, who believed he had discovered fundamental truth about nature of reality. A truth that positioned Mehrunes Dagon not as invader, but as rightful owner, reclaiming stolen property. Camoran's early life remains partially obscured by deliberate obfuscation and mythologizing by his followers. What is known is that he was born in late Third Era to parents involved in Daedric worship. He showed aptitude for magical study from young age. He pursued knowledge with intensity that concerned even those who taught him. Where other students accepted standard interpretations of metaphysical texts, Camoran questioned fundamental assumptions underlying those interpretations. His academic career before founding the Mythic Dawn was marked by brilliance and controversy. He published treatises challenging conventional understanding of creation myths. He argued that distinctions between Aedra and Daedra were artificial categories imposed by mortal scholars rather than reflecting actual metaphysical reality. He suggested that Mundus was not gift from loving gods, but prison created through cosmic crime. These ideas were dismissed by mainstream scholars as interesting thought experiments with no practical significance. But Camoran believed them absolutely. And if Mundus was prison, then perhaps someone imprisoned within it might justify breaking free. And if Aedra, who created Mundus, were criminals who trapped spirits that should have remained free, then perhaps Daedra, who refused to participate in creation, were righteous ones. And if Mehrunes Dagon represented change and revolution, perhaps his sphere included liberation from unjust constraints, the logical chain that led Camoran to become devoted, servant of Mehrunes Dagon, followed twisted but internally consistent path. If Mundus was mistake that should never have existed, then destroying it was not evil, but correction. If mortals bound to Mundus were prisoners who didn't realize their imprisonment, then freeing them through death and transformation was mercy. If Mehrunes Dagon offered path to escaping false reality, then serving him was enlightenment rather than damnation. This philosophy distinguished Camoran from typical Daedra worshipper who sought power for personal gain. He genuinely believed he was hero of his own story. That history would vindicate his actions, that future generations would recognize him as liberator rather than destroyer. This self-perception made him more dangerous than mere power seeker, because he acted with conviction that transcended self-interest. His discovery of the Mysterium Xarxes changed everything. The book was artifact of Hermaeus Mora, Daedric Prince of Knowledge and Fate, written by someone whose identity was lost to history. The text contained information about nature of Oblivion, relationships between Daedric princes and mortal realm, methods of traversing barriers between worlds. Most who encountered the book found it incomprehensible. Pages filled with symbols that shifted when observed, text that seemed to change based on readers' knowledge and assumptions. Camoran spent years studying the Mysterium Xarxes. He learned to read its shifting text, to extract meaning from apparent chaos, to see patterns that others missed. What he discovered convinced him that invasion of Mundus by Daedric Prince was possible. Not easy, not simple, but possible if correct conditions were established and precise rituals performed. The book did not explicitly provide instructions for such invasion, but Camoran believed he could derive them from principles the text revealed. His interpretation of the Mysterium Xarxes led him to several conclusions that formed foundation of Mythic Dawn theology. First, that Mehrunes Dagon was not merely Daedric Prince, but was specifically Prince most capable of reshaping reality through destruction. Second, that Mundus existed in weakened state following Oblivion Crisis centuries prior, making it more vulnerable to invasion than previously. Third, that artifact called Amulet of Kings, which maintained barrier between Oblivion and Mundus, could be compromised if right conditions occurred. From these conclusions, plan emerged. Find way to eliminate Emperor and his heirs, who wore Amulet of Kings and maintained its power through their divine blood connection. Create crisis that would weaken barriers between worlds. Open gates to Oblivion across Tamriel simultaneously, forcing defenders to spread resources thin. Use the chaos to allow Mehrunes Dagon himself to enter Mundus physically. Once present, Dagon's power would be sufficient to reshape or destroy mortal realm according to his will. The audacity of this plan cannot be overstated. Daedric princes had influenced mortal affairs throughout history, but direct physical invasion of Mundus by Prince himself had never been seriously attempted. The barriers established during creation of the world, reinforced by Akatosh's covenant, specifically prevented such manifestation. What Camoran proposed was not merely crime, but violation of metaphysical laws that had governed reality since its beginning. But Camoran believed he had found the loophole. If Emperor and his heirs died without successor, the amulet's power would fail. If the dragonfires in Temple of the One went unlit for long enough, the barrier would weaken. If multiple breaches occurred simultaneously, the barrier might shatter entirely. None of these conditions alone would be sufficient, but altogether might create moment when impossible became briefly possible. To accomplish this required more than scholarly knowledge. It required organization, resources, committed followers willing to sacrifice everything for cause they believed righteous. Camoran needed to build cult unlike any that had served Mehrunes Dagon before. Not collection of isolated destructive individuals, but army of true believers who understood the mission and would execute it with precision. Thus he founded the Mythic Dawn. The name itself was statement of purpose. Mythic suggesting scale beyond ordinary, mortal concerns. Dawn indicating new beginning, the two together promising transformation of reality itself. Members were recruited not through promises of personal power, but through philosophical conversion. They had to believe, as Camoran did, that destroying Mundus was a necessary act of liberation rather than genocide. The recruitment process was careful and slow. Camoran identified individuals who showed dissatisfaction with existing order, who questioned conventional wisdom about nature of reality, who demonstrated willingness to pursue truth regardless of where it led. He approached them not as cult leader, but as fellow seeker sharing discoveries. He introduced them to his interpretation of the Mysterium Xarxes gradually, allowing them to reach conclusions that seemed like their own realizations, rather than imposed dogma. Those who converted became true believers, with fervor that made them dangerous beyond typical cultists. They were not nihilists seeking destruction for its own sake. They were revolutionaries, convinced they served higher purpose. They saw themselves as heroes who would be remembered as liberators after old world burned and new world emerged from ashes. This conviction made them willing to die for cause, and more importantly, willing to kill systematically and efficiently rather than randomly and emotionally. The Mythic Dawn's structure reflected Camoran's scholarly background. Ranks were based on understanding of doctrine rather than simply time served or personal power. Members progressed through levels of initiation, each revealing deeper truths about the Dawn's mission. Lower ranks believed they were fighting corrupt empire and incompetent rulers. Middle ranks understood they served Mehrunes Dagon and sought to bring him into Mundus. Highest ranks knew the full scope, that success meant potential ending of reality as mortals understood it. This compartmentalization served multiple purposes. It protected core mission if lower members were captured and interrogated. It allowed recruitment of individuals who would never agree to total mission, but would support revolution against empire. It created incentive for members to prove themselves worthy of advancement by demonstrating commitment through increasingly extreme actions. And it ensured that those who truly understood what they were working toward had already crossed so many moral lines that retreat was psychologically impossible. The Dawn operated for years before taking significant action. They gathered resources, recruited members, established safe houses across Cyrodiil and beyond. They studied security around imperial family, identifying vulnerabilities. They trained for combat and infiltration. They prepared for moment when opportunity would arise to strike at Emperor, and they waited for Camoran's signal that time was right. Mankar Camoran himself remained enigmatic figure even to his own followers. He was charismatic enough to inspire devotion, but distant enough to maintain mystery. He claimed to have achieved immortality through understanding revealed by Mysterium Xarxes. He demonstrated magical abilities that seemed to exceed normal mortal capacity. He spoke with absolute certainty about future that included world reborn in fire. Whether he truly believed everything he preached or was a sophisticated manipulator using belief as tool is question history cannot definitively answer. What is certain is that his planning was meticulous. Every element of the coming invasion had been considered. Every contingency had backup plan. Every risk had been calculated and accepted. When Mythic Dawn finally moved against Emperor Uriel Septim VII, it was not desperate gamble, but carefully orchestrated opening move in campaign that had been planned down to smallest detail, and it succeeded beyond what most thought possible. Chapter 5. The Oblivion Crisis, when destruction came to Nirn. The assassination of Emperor Uriel Septim VII and his 3 known heirs occurred on single night in year 3, E433. The The Mythic Dawn had infiltrated Imperial Palace security, placed agents in positions of trust, prepared escape routes and false identities. When they struck, it was with precision that suggested military operation rather than cult violence. The Emperor and his guards were ambushed in tunnels beneath the palace. Despite fighting skill and magical protection, the Emperor was killed. His sons died the same night in separate coordinated attacks. The immediate aftermath was confusion. Imperial governments struggled to understand who was responsible and why. The Mythic Dawn left no obvious signature. Their agents disappeared into chaos following the assassinations. Public explanation was that unknown group of anarchists had attacked Empire. Investigation would take time. In meanwhile, Empire would continue, functioning under Elder Council's direction while succession was determined. But those who understood significance of dragonfires recognized catastrophic implications immediately. Without Emperor or heir to light the fires, barrier between Oblivion and Mundus was vulnerable, not gone. The previous lighting provided protection that would persist for time, but weakening. And if fires remained unlit long enough, gates to Oblivion could open. The first gate appeared in Wilderness of Cyrodiil 3 days after Emperor's death. Witnesses described massive structure materializing from nothing. Towers of dark stone and burning metal rising hundreds of feet high. Causeway extending from gate to surrounding landscape. And pouring from the opening, Daedra. Dremora warriors in full armor. Scamps throwing fire from their hands. Clanfear with claws that tore through steel. Creatures of Oblivion invading Mundus in numbers not seen since mythic ages. Local guards and mages responded to First Gate without understanding what they faced. They believed it was an isolated incident. Rogue summoner who had opened portal and lost control. They attacked with confidence that quickly turned to horror as they realized the Daedra kept coming. That closing the gate required more than simply killing visible enemies. That the structure itself needed to be destroyed from within by entering Oblivion realm it connected to and shutting down the mechanism powering it. Before counter-strategy could be developed, more gates opened. In cities, in villages, in wilderness areas, across Cyrodiil, then in other provinces. Skyrim saw gates appear near major cities. Morrowind's coast was invaded. Hammerfell's deserts burned with new fire. Black Marsh witnessed gates opening in swamps. Everywhere across Tamriel, barriers between worlds were failing as dragonfires remained unlit and Amulet of Kings sat powerless. The scale of invasion overwhelmed initial defenses. Each gate required heroes willing to enter. Oblivion itself, navigate hostile realm, reach the sigil stone powering the gate, and remove it while fighting through armies of Daedra. Some succeeded. Many died trying, and even successful closures were temporary victories because new gates continued opening faster than old ones could be shut. The Mythic Dawn revealed themselves during this chaos. They distributed copies of Camoran's writings explaining that invasion was righteous act of liberation, that Mehrunes Dagon was reclaiming what had been stolen from him, that those who embraced coming change would transcend mortality, while those who resisted would simply die. The message found surprising number of converts among population exhausted by constant danger and looking for any explanation that offered hope, even if that hope involved embracing Destroyer. Imperial forces struggled to coordinate defense across province-wide crisis. Military was stretched impossibly thin, trying to protect cities, close gates, hunt Mythic Dawn cells, and maintain order among panicking population. Mages Guild devoted resources to studying gates and developing strategies for closure, but research took time that was measured in lives lost daily. The Elder Council debated whether to negotiate with Mythic Dawn or pursue total war, unable to agree on strategy while Empire burned. In cities where gates opened inside walls, devastation was immediate and catastrophic. Daedra materialized in streets and began killing everything living. Citizens fled, but had nowhere to go. Gates opened faster than populations could evacuate. Military rushed to defend civilian areas, but found themselves in close quarters urban combat against foes who felt no fear and could only be killed through overwhelming force. Buildings burned, districts fell. Survivors told stories of incomprehensible horror as reality itself seemed to break down. The psychological impact was as significant as physical destruction. Citizens of Tamriel had lived generations in relative peace, believing the world was stable, that threats could be managed through normal military and political means. Daedric invasion shattered that assumption. The gates represented failure of fundamental laws that supposedly governed reality. If Oblivion could invade Mundus, if Daedric princes could manifest armies in cities, then nothing was certain. Tomorrow might not come. Order might not be restored. The world might actually end. This existential terror made population vulnerable to Mythic Dawn's message. Their proclamations that old world was ending and new world emerging found receptive audience among those who had lost everything and needed to believe the horror served some purpose. Converts joined not from sudden belief in Mehrunes Dagon's righteousness, but from desperate need for narrative that made sense of senseless destruction. If invasion was liberation rather than genocide, perhaps they could salvage meaning from meaninglessness. Meanwhile, Daedra themselves operated with efficiency that suggested coordination beyond simple bloodlust. They targeted strategic locations, armories, mage halls, government buildings. They destroyed infrastructure that might support organized resistance. They seemed to know where defenders were weakest and concentrated forces accordingly. This strategic coherence was terrifying because it indicated the invasion was not random breach, but calculated campaign with clear objectives. The nature of Oblivion, gates themselves posed unique challenge. Each gate connected to Pocket Realm within Mehrunes Dagon's Deadlands, specifically constructed for the invasion. The realms were labyrinths designed to confuse and exhaust those attempting to close gates. Towers held sigil stones at their peaks, requiring anyone seeking to close gate to fight their way up through multiple levels while under constant attack. The architecture defied normal physical laws, stairs that led to nowhere, passages that looped impossibly, gravity that shifted unpredictably. Those who entered gates and survived to tell of it described realms of fire and blood, skies burning perpetually, rivers of lava, platforms of dark stone connected by narrow bridges over bottomless voids, torture chambers where captured mortals suffered at Dremora hands, their screams echoing across impossible distances, and everywhere sense of presence, that Mehrunes Dagon himself was aware of intruders in his realm and amused by their attempts to close gates one at a time, while he opened dozens more. The heroism displayed during Oblivion Crisis became legendary. Individuals who entered gates knowing they would likely die, mages who exhausted themselves closing one gate after another until their bodies gave out, warriors who held city streets against impossible odds so civilians could evacuate, citizens who sheltered strangers and shared resources during worst days. The crisis brought out both best and worst in people, often from same individuals at different moments. But heroism alone was insufficient. The gates kept opening. The Daedra kept coming. Resources were depleting. Hope was failing. Empire needed solution that went beyond brave individuals closing gates one at a time. They needed way to close all gates simultaneously and permanently. They needed to relight dragonfires, and for that, they needed heir to Septim bloodline, which is where unexpected figure emerged. Priest named Martin, living quietly in small chapel, unknown to himself and world as bastard son of Uriel Septim VII. When discovered and brought to Imperial City, he represented last hope. Only he could wear Amulet of Kings. Only he could perform ritual that would restore barrier between Oblivion and Mundus. Only he could end invasion that threatened to consume all of Tamriel. But Mankar Camoran and the Mythic Dawn knew this too, and they had prepared for this possibility. Chapter 6. Martin Septim and the Amulet of Kings. Martin Septim's life before the crisis was unremarkable by imperial standards. Raised away from palace by mother who never revealed his father's identity, he grew up believing himself common citizen. He pursued religious calling, becoming priest of Akatosh, serving small community. His scholarly inclination led him to study history and theology, but purely from academic interest rather than practical application. He knew nothing of power or politics. He wanted nothing to do with either. The revelation of his parentage was trauma that destroyed life he had built. Suddenly, he was heir to throne during greatest crisis empire had faced in centuries. His quiet existence of service and study was ripped away. He was thrust into role requiring leadership, courage, and willingness to sacrifice self for greater good. Most would have broken under such transformation. Martin accepted burden because he understood that refusing meant condemning, world to destruction. But accepting destiny and achieving it were different matters. The Amulet of Kings had been stolen from Imperial Palace by Mythic Dawn during confusion following assassinations. Without it, Martin could not light dragonfires. Without dragonfires, Barrier remained vulnerable. The first task was recovering the amulet from cult that would stop at nothing to prevent its recovery. The hunt for Mythic Dawn's strongholds became desperate race. Imperial forces tracked rumors and interrogated captured cultists. They raided suspected safe houses. They followed leads through Cyrodiil's wilderness to hidden temples where Dawn gathered. Each raid revealed piece of larger organization. Each captured document pointed toward ultimate destination, Camoran's paradise. Mankar Camoran had created his own realm of Oblivion using power derived from Mysterium Xarxes. Paradise was pocket dimension that existed outside normal reality, accessible only through specific portals. Within it, Camoran was effectively God, able to shape reality according to will. The Amulet of Kings was held there, protected by Camoran personally and by armies of Dremora loyal to Mehrunes Dagon. Retrieving it would require entering Paradise and confronting Camoran directly. This task fell to Hero of Kvatch, individual who would become legendary as savior of Tamriel. Whether through destiny or chance, this person had been present when first gates opened. They had entered Oblivion and successfully closed gates. They had fought Daedra and survived. They had proven capable of impossible tasks. When Martin needed someone to enter Paradise and recover the amulet, Hero of Kvatch accepted. The journey into Camoran's paradise revealed the depth of his madness or enlightenment, depending on perspective. The realm was beautiful and horrible simultaneously. Gardens of impossible plants that moved with predatory intelligence. Palaces of crystal that sang with voices of those imprisoned within. Rivers flowing with liquids that might have been water or might have been something else entirely. And throughout, mortals who had been transformed by Camoran's power, serving him as they believed they had achieved transcendence while their minds and bodies twisted into mockeries of human form. Mankar Camoran himself greeted the hero with hospitality rather than hostility. He attempted to convert them, explaining his philosophy, demonstrating the truth as he understood it. Mundus was prison, Mehrunes Dagon was liberator. Those who embraced transformation would transcend mortal limitations. Those who clung to false reality would perish with world they tried to preserve. The offer was genuine. Join the dawn, achieve paradise, escape the coming destruction with benefits of enlightenment. The hero refused. The confrontation that followed was less battle than statement of opposing philosophies made manifest. Camoran fought with absolute conviction in righteousness of his cause. Hero fought with equally absolute determination to preserve world Camoran sought to destroy. Magic clashed, blades met, and ultimately, in realm where Camoran should have been invincible, he fell. Because for all his power and certainty, he was still mortal, facing individual touched by destiny with weight that exceeded even Daedric Prince's favor. Camoran's death shattered paradise. The realm collapsed back into unreality from which it had been formed. The Amulet of Kings fell into Hero's hands, and across Tamriel, Mythic Dawn cultists felt loss of their leader and began to despair or scatter. The Dawn had been Camoran's vision made manifest. Without him, it was merely a collection of isolated believers pursuing goal they no longer fully understood. But the crisis was not ended. Gates remained open. Daedra continued invading. And worst of all, Mehrunes Dagon himself was preparing direct manifestation. The death of Camoran and destruction of Mythic Dawn had removed human agents, but the Prince of Destruction was beyond death and operated according to timescales that made mortal victory meaningless. The gates had weakened barrier sufficiently. The dragonfires had remained unlit long enough. Conditions were met. Dagon was coming. Martin reached Imperial City with Amulet as Dagon began to manifest. The Daedric Prince appeared as impossibility given form, massive beyond comprehension, composed of elements that could not coexist in normal reality, radiating power that cracked stone and boiled water through mere proximity. He was not simply large creature but actual Daedric Prince, manifesting in Mundus with full awareness and intent. Every step destroyed buildings. Every gesture sent citizens fleeing in terror. Every moment he remained in mortal realm weakened the fabric of reality further. The Temple of the One was besieged by Daedra. Imperial forces held gate against overwhelming numbers, buying time for Martin to complete ritual. The dragonfires were lit. The amulet was empowered. And then Martin made decision that ensured his legacy as savior of Tamriel. He shattered the amulet, releasing all its accumulated power in single moment, calling upon Akatosh himself to manifest and drive back Mehrunes Dagon. What happened next exists in realm between history and myth. Witnesses describe Dragon of Light emerging from temple, growing to match Dagon's size. Akatosh made manifest, taking physical form for first time since creation of world. The two immortal beings clashed in streets of Imperial City. Dragon of time and order against Prince of destruction and change. The battle lasted moments or hours depending on who you ask. Time itself became uncertain in presence of beings who existed partially outside it. Akatosh prevailed because Mundus was his creation, and Dagon was intruder. The Prince of Destruction was driven back to Oblivion. The gates across Tamriel closed simultaneously as barrier was restored with power greater than dragonfires had ever provided, and Martin Septim, who had called upon Akatosh and channeled power sufficient to save the world, was consumed by that power. He died achieving what he was born for, not ruling empire but sacrificing himself to preserve it. The Oblivion Crisis ended with victory that felt like defeat. The invasion was stopped. The world was saved. But cost was measured in cities destroyed, populations decimated, faith in stability shattered. The empire survived but was diminished. The certainty that had governed reality for millennia was broken. Mortals now knew that Daedric princes could invade Mundus if conditions allowed. That apocalypse was not distant myth, but real possibility that had nearly occurred and might occur again. Mehrunes Dagon retreated to Deadlands but was not defeated in any meaningful sense. Daedric princes cannot be truly harmed by mortal actions. They are immortal, eternal, beyond damage or death. What Martin accomplished was not killing Dagon, but restoring barrier that prevented his direct presence in Mundus. The Prince of Destruction remains in his realm, unchanged and unrepentant, still embodying his sphere, still capable of influencing mortal world through cultists and artifacts. The question that haunted survivors was whether invasion had been victory for Dagon despite failure to destroy Mundus. He had proven invasion was possible. He had demonstrated weakness in barrier mortals thought impenetrable. He had shown that under right circumstances, Daedric Prince could walk freely on Nirn. And perhaps most significantly, he had forced sacrifice of Amulet of Kings. The barrier was restored, but at cost that could not be repeated. Next time, and survivors feared there would be next time, different solution would be required. Chapter 7. The Eternal Nature of Destruction. The aftermath of the Oblivion Crisis revealed truth about Mehrunes Dagon that scholarly understanding had failed to fully grasp. He cannot be defeated. not in sense that victory means enemy is eliminated and can no longer threaten you. Dagon is concept-given consciousness. Destruction is fundamental aspect of reality. You can resist specific act of destruction. You can prevent particular instance of invasion, but you cannot end destruction itself. It continues as long as reality exists. This understanding transformed how mortals approached worship of and defense against Mehrunes Dagon. Before Crisis, dominant view was that Daedric princes were powerful beings who could be opposed through sufficient force or virtue. After Crisis, recognition spread that Daedric princes were more like natural forces. You do not oppose earthquake by attacking it. You prepare for earthquakes, build structures to withstand them, accept that they will occur regardless of your wishes. Similarly, you cannot oppose Mehrunes Dagon's existence. You can only prepare for his influence and resist specific manifestations of his will. The practical implications were significant. Cults of Mehrunes Dagon could not be permanently eliminated because new groups would always form. The philosophical appeal of destruction as transformation would always attract followers. The promise of revolutionary change would always entice those dissatisfied with existing order. Law enforcement adapted from trying to eliminate Dagon worship entirely to identifying and disrupting groups before they accomplished significant violence. Scholars of Daedric studies developed a more sophisticated understanding of how Dagon's sphere operated. They recognized that not all destruction serves his sphere equally. Random violence, while destructive, lacks the transformative purpose that Dagon represents. Gradual decay, while eventually destroying what exists, does not embody active change his sphere requires. What truly serves Mehrunes Dagon is destruction that clears space for something different, regardless of whether that difference represents improvement or decline. This philosophical insight helped explain why Dagon had supported Mythic Dawn's invasion despite its ultimate failure. The crisis had transformed Tamriel. The political order was permanently altered. Faith in imperial institutions was broken. Certainty about barrier between Oblivion and Mundus was shattered. These transformations served Dagon's sphere, regardless of whether invasion succeeded in literal conquest. By forcing change through destruction, even failed invasion accomplished his purpose. The long-term effects of Crisis rippled across centuries. The empire never fully recovered its authority. Provinces increasingly operated independently, seeing Imperial City as unable to protect them. When Stormcrown Interregnum occurred after Crisis, succession disputes that previously would have been managed devolved into civil conflict. The Great War with Aldmeri Dominion centuries later found Empire too weakened to resist effectively. Each consequence traced back to moment when Mehrunes Dagon had walked streets of Imperial City and shattered assumptions about security and permanence. In Skyrim during Fourth Era, evidence of Dagon's continued influence appeared in form of Mehrunes' Razor questline. The blade resurfaced, hidden by Mythic Dawn remnants who believed assembling it would allow Dagon to manifest again. Whether this belief was accurate or simply cultist fantasy, the quest to recover blade pieces demonstrated that Dagon's artifacts persisted across eras, waiting for new wielders who would serve destruction's purpose, whether intentionally or not. The philosophical legacy of Mankar Camoran also endured. His writings, despite being officially banned and destroyed, survived through copies hidden by true believers. New generation of scholars encountered his arguments about nature of Mundus and found them intellectually compelling, even if practically horrifying. The question of whether existence as mortals experience it is prison or gift remained unresolved. Camoran's answer, that liberation requires destruction, was rejected by mainstream society but never definitively refuted. The Mythic Dawn itself fragmented but never disappeared entirely. Small groups claiming name appeared sporadically across provinces. Most were little more than social clubs for people who liked reading forbidden texts and pretending at danger. A few were genuine believers attempting to continue Camoran's work. None came close to accomplishing what he did, but their existence demonstrated that ideas, like Daedric Princes, cannot be killed. They persist, dormant or active, waiting for conditions that favor their resurgence. Mehrunes Dagon's relationship with other Daedric princes provided additional context for understanding his actions. Among the princes, he was neither leader nor pariah, but one among equals pursuing his nature. Some princes had opposed his invasion. Azura and Meridia in particular saw destruction of Mundus as affront to cosmic order. Others were indifferent. Hermaeus Mora cared only about accumulating knowledge, regardless of whose realm it came from. A few may have quietly supported Dagon, seeing opportunity in chaos his invasion created. This dynamic revealed that Daedric politics, if such term applies to beings beyond mortal political concepts, operates according to principles mortals can barely comprehend. Alliances form and dissolve based on spheres aligning temporarily. Conflicts arise not from personal animosity, but from spheres being fundamentally opposed. Cooperation occurs when multiple princes benefit from same outcome. And through it all, each prince pursues their nature with consistency that appears as will, but might be more accurately understood as cosmic inevitability. Mehrunes Dagon's realm, the Deadlands, remained accessible to those foolish or desperate enough to travel there. Daedric scholars mapped portions of the realm, catalogued its inhabitants, studied mechanisms by which Dremora society functioned. What they discovered was that realm was simultaneously utterly alien and strangely familiar. The hierarchies, the rituals, the architecture, all reflected mortal organizational patterns but twisted through lens of destruction. Order serving chaos, structure enabling transformation, permanence in service of ending. The psychological impact on mortals who study Mehrunes Dagon too deeply became recognized phenomenon. Scholars who spent years researching his sphere sometimes began to exhibit behavioral changes. They became dissatisfied with existing order, even when previously content. They saw flaws in institutions they had supported. They found themselves drawn to revolutionary ideas and justifications for violence. Whether this represented genuine corruption by Dagon's influence, or simply natural consequence of deeply engaging with philosophy of destruction, remained debated. Religious responses to crisis varied by faith and region. Priests of Akatosh pointed to Martin's sacrifice as proof their deity actively protected creation from Daedric threats. Followers of other divines argued each divine had contributed to victory in ways less visible, but equally important. Skeptics noted that gods had barely intervened until mortal realm was on verge of destruction, suggesting divine care for mortals was less consistent than religions claimed. The debates intensified faith for some while eroding it for others. The practical knowledge gained from crisis proved valuable for future defense against Daedric threats. Methods for closing Oblivion gates were documented and taught. Procedures for identifying and disrupting Daedric cults were refined. Understanding of how barriers between realms functioned improved. Imperial City rebuilt Temple of the One with enchantments specifically designed to resist Daedric manifestation. These preparations could not prevent all future threats, but would make similar invasion more difficult. Yet underlying all preparations was recognition that Mehrunes Dagon would try again eventually. Not necessarily through direct invasion, he had learned that approach required exceptional circumstances and ultimately failed, but through subtler means, through artifacts that corrupted wielders gradually, through cults that destabilized regions slowly, through philosophies that undermined faith in existing order over generations. Destruction does not require apocalyptic invasion. Small destructions accumulate into transformation just as surely as single catastrophic event. The mortals who lived through crisis and survived carried knowledge that younger generations struggle to truly comprehend. They had seen world nearly end. They had witnessed Daedric Prince walk among them. They had watched cities burn and order collapse. They knew, in way that could not be conveyed through mere description, how fragile civilization's foundations were, how quickly normal could become nightmare, how thin the barrier stood between comfortable existence and absolute chaos. This knowledge manifested as wisdom that seemed like pessimism to those who hadn't experienced crisis directly. The survivors were cautious about trusting institutions, skeptical of grand promises, prepared for worst even when planning for best. They taught their children to not take stability for granted, to maintain skills that would let them survive without civilization's support, to recognize signs that order was breaking down before collapse became irreversible. These lessons were practical wisdom born from terrible experience. But mortals are resilient in ways that even Daedric princes perhaps don't fully appreciate. The world that emerged from crisis was wounded but healing. Cities were rebuilt. New systems replaced ones that failed. Generation that hadn't experienced invasion directly grew to adulthood knowing of it only through stories. Life continued because life continues. Mehrunes Dagon had brought destruction intending transformation, and transformation occurred, but not necessarily in ways he would have chosen or even recognized as serving his sphere. In the grand scope of existence, the Oblivion Crisis was moment. Brief upheaval in history of world that had existed for millennia and would exist for millennia more. Mehrunes Dagon had tried to remake reality and failed, but he had also proven that such attempts were possible, that barriers could be breached, that Daedric princes could directly act in Mundus under right circumstances. And this knowledge, once gained, could not be lost. The Prince of Destruction waits still in the Deadlands, watching, planning, existing as he has always existed and always will exist. He is not discouraged by failure because discouragement implies hope. That can be disappointed, and Daedric princes do not hope. They simply are what they are, pursuing their nature eternally. Next opportunity to bring destruction and transformation will eventually arise. When it does, Mehrunes Dagon will be ready, because that is what he is. That is what he does. That is his eternal nature. And mortals who would resist that nature must be equally eternal in vigilance, because destruction, like its prince, never truly ends. It simply waits for next moment when ending becomes possible, when old must give way to new, when stability must yield to change, when order must break before transformation. These moments are inevitable. How mortals respond when they arrive determines whether civilization endures or whether next version of reality emerges from ashes of current one. The Razor still exists, cycling through wielders. The Mysterium Xarxes remains in some hidden location, waiting for next scholar who believes they have decoded its ultimate secrets. The Deadlands stand eternal, pocket realm, where destruction is not tragedy, but function. The cults reform under new names with new leaders, following same philosophical path. The warnings from crisis slowly fade, as comfortable ignorance replaces traumatic memory. But through it all, Mehrunes Dagon endures, unchanged, unrepentant, patient, because Daedric princes have eternity, and destruction eventually comes for everything. Tonight, we have walked through realm of destruction, from understanding what destruction truly means to Daedric Prince who embodies it, from artifact that ends all life to cults that worship ending, from prophet who believed prison should be escape to crisis that nearly consumed the world. Mehrunes Dagon is force that cannot be reasoned with or defeated in conventional sense. He is principle given consciousness, change through destruction made into being that acts with will and purpose. His sphere is not evil or good, but simply is. Like fire that burns regardless of whether flame serves useful purpose or causes tragedy, Dagon destroys regardless of whether that destruction creates space for something better or simply ends what existed. The Oblivion Crisis stands as testament to what happens when destruction is given freedom to act without constraint. The world was nearly lost. Uncountable lives were ended. Civilization was brought to edge of collapse. And yet worlds survived, because individuals chose to resist, because Martin Septim sacrificed himself, because Hero of Kvatch entered oblivion again and again, because common people held the line when holding seemed impossible. But survival came with cost and knowledge. The cost was measured in ruins that took generations to rebuild. The knowledge was recognition that nothing is truly permanent, that security is temporary state, that order will always eventually face forces that seek to tear it down. That apocalypse is not distant myth, but real possibility, prevented only through constant vigilance and willingness to sacrifice when necessary. Mehrunes Dagon's story does not end because his nature is eternal. Destruction will always be aspect of reality. Change will always require something old to end before something new can begin. Revolution will always tempt those dissatisfied with existing conditions. The Razor will always find new wielders. The cults will always reform under new names. The gates might open again if future generations forget the lessons learned through pain. What mortals must remember is that destruction, while inevitable, is not irresistible. That change can be gradual rather than violent. That revolution can be peaceful rather than bloody. That ending something does not require ending everything. The choice between Dagon's way and alternative paths remains available. Each generation must make that choice anew. Each individual must decide whether destruction serves their purposes, or whether preservation and careful change offer better path forward. The Prince of Destruction watches from the Deadlands, patient, eternal, waiting for next opportunity, for next crisis, for next individual who believes his message of liberation through ending. And when that moment comes, as it inevitably will, mortals must choose again whether to resist or embrace what Dagon represents, whether to fight for world as it is, or burn it down, hoping something better emerges from ashes. The story of Mehrunes Dagon is not complete because it cannot be completed. It continues as long as reality exists, as long as things can be destroyed and transformed, as long as mortals must navigate between preservation and change. The prince endures, his sphere persists, and those who would live in world not consumed by flame must remember what destruction truly costs, must understand that some endings are necessary, but wholesale destruction rarely creates what destroyers imagine. The Deadlands burn eternal. The Razor waits for next wielder. The cultists gather in shadows planning their revolutions. And somewhere in Oblivion, Mehrunes Dagon exists as he has always existed, not plotting or scheming in mortal sense, simply being what he is, Prince of Destruction, force of transformation, ending made manifest, and that will never change, because change is all he is.